Welcome to From the Deep. I am Mike the Finder, and with me, as always, is Book of Brett.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about Malignant from 2021. Now, before we even get started here, I just want to point out this is a brand new format. This is also a brand new channel. This is all brand new. We're sort of refiguring everything here. And because of that, this new format may take a couple tries to really nail down how we're exactly going to do this. But the idea here is we're basically going to be doing movie reviews in podcast form, but cutting all of the fat off the podcast as far as all of our catching up and all of that stuff. So these are shorter, more refined movie review episodes, but in a podcast kind of format. Does that make sense? Oh, we kept getting all of these people coming to our reviews on our podcast and being like, blah, 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 blah. Why is the first 40 minutes of this you two just talking? And it's like, well, it was a podcast. Like, that was kind of the whole idea. But other
no one
than that,
cares what you're doing.
That's, I think, more than anything, that's what it is, right? Because, they came for the title and the thumbnail, which the title and the thumbnail are, this is this movie that we're doing. And when you click on that, and then for 40 minutes, you and I talk about what we've been doing for the last month and a half, it's a little, I could see how that would be a little infuriating.
Yeah, no. We find us to be more important than other people do. I totally get it.
Well, everyone's their own main character, right? Okay, so like I said, today we're going to be talking about Malignant from 2021. Do you want to give us a small little rundown of what this movie is?
So, without getting into too many details, it's basically about this girl, Madison, who's played by Annabelle Wallis. She was actually in the original Annabelle movie, which I loved. And she is basically terrorized by these visions of people dying and murders happening. And she's basically trying to figure out why this is happening, while also having a little bit of a creature feature aspect to the whole thing.
Okay, so let's just start off. What are your overall feelings on this? Because
I really liked this movie.
Okay,
I had a ton of fun with this because I went into this completely blind. I didn't look up any reviews. I didn't look up anything. Brittany was actually the one that suggested this movie, and so we ended up watching it, and I really liked it, but I liked it because it had that 80s creature feature vibe to it,
right?
Without being overly campy. I mean, it's definitely campy, but it's self-aware campy, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does.
It's very aware that it's being campy, and that kind of pulled me in from the very outset. So I really liked it, but I'm interested to see what you thought of it, because if you remember, I suggested it and I said, I think this is something you'll really like and it's up your alley, because in my mind, I'm watching this and I had this vision of you watching Chud and and enjoying movies like that. And this is definitely that campy, gory 80s creature feature. I mean, the end of the opening scene is the lady going, "It's time to cut out the cancer," and even the delivery is very campy on purpose, but at the same time it's never it's comedic in a way, but it's almost fun comedic, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
you're not laughing at it to make fun of it, you're laughing at it because it's almost making fun of itself, but it's still putting out a good movie out there. I thought I really liked it.
Well, so okay, I'm kind of torn on this movie, if I'm being really, really honest here.
Okay.
On one hand, I totally get where you're coming from, because it's self-aware and it's sort of making fun of stuff, but it's also doing it in this really weird sort of a way. I didn't see as much 80s stuff in it as much as I saw early to mid 2000s stuff in it.
Okay.
I didn't. I can see where some of the influence from 80s monster movies and stuff like that, even 70s monster movies, come in. But no, I'm torn on this movie because it's on one hand, I totally get that it's super self-aware, and I complain all the time about we've moved away from cheese and sort of self-aware, goofy 80s horror. And on the other hand, this movie has this really weird, takes itself seriously kind of vibe. And so it's sort of like, I didn't see, for instance, I recently watched Psycho Goreman. I don't know if you've watched Psycho Goreman.
I've never even heard of Psycho Gore. I would imagine a lot of people listening to this are probably in the same boat as me.
Okay, so Psycho
where they've not even
Goreman,
heard of that.
Psycho Goreman is this movie where two kids find this like monster type guy, and it's almost like kind of like an 80s kids horror movie back in the day, like Little Monsters or something like that. But it's new. And that movie is very self-aware and a little too on the nose, because it's like, when I walked away from that movie, I walked away feeling like that was a little too targeted at me and my generation. That's kind of how I walked away from it.
I feel like I remember you telling me this.
Yeah, I think we did talk about it on one of the episodes before this, but that's how I walked away from that. From this, I didn't quite get that. I don't know who this movie is aimed at. Like that's my main thing.
Well, it's funny you say that, because if you go and watch the trailers for this movie make it seem like it's something completely different than what it is. And it almost feels like Chris Stuckman put it really well when he said it almost seems like they didn't know who to market this movie at. And if you go and watch the trailers, I think that's a very accurate way of putting it, because the trailers make it come off as this like serious supernatural movie. Kind of like, because it is done by James Wan, who I love.
Right.
And he's done Saw.
He's done The Conjuring and Saw and a couple others.
Conjuring, right? Saw,
like serious movies.
Insidious. Yeah. Like serious horror movies, where even those, like The Conjuring's a great example, where it has that old school vibe to it. But it almost has that old school vibe simply because of the setting that it's in. It's set in the 70s, 60s, 80s, depending on which movie you're watching.
Right.
And so it felt like they didn't know who to target this movie at. And I think it's because there's a lot of different genres of this movie rolled into one movie. You have the creature feature aspect. The beginning of it makes it feel like a supernatural movie. You can almost get a vibe of like the intruder genre in there as well. And
there's a bit of home invasion stuff in there.
See, I thought it did it really well though. Like I felt like I didn't feel like it was. I didn't feel like it was lost in trying to find itself, if that makes any sense.
I kind of felt differently, because halfway through, first of all, this movie is 1:50, which is...
Yeah, it's a bit of a long runtime.
The first little bit, I understand why all this is set up, but the first, I would say 35 minutes or so, really drags. And there's not a lot happening other than maybe some domestic violence and... a setup for later.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that could be trimmed down a little bit, but I also felt like halfway through they kind of chickened out on this serious movie that they were making and kind of went, oh, well, this guy's kind of backwards, man. And they didn't really know how to portray that. So
that's why I like the opening to it, because I feel like the opening to this movie really does set the tone. Because first of all, I do want to mention the cinematography. I thought was awesome.
Yeah,
like there are some amazing.
Very, very well. So there's a little bit too much dolly use and a little bit too much gimbal on a Steadicam use for me.
Right.
And that's a me thing, I think, because I can really tell when somebody's using a gimbal, because the movements are so fake and weird looking, and it's all over this movie. The dolly shots are cool, but they're maybe a little overused. And then then you've got somebody clearly with a gimbal on a Steadicam walking around for a lot of this movie as well, and it just bothered me. It just bothered me because those fake weird digital pans and stuff, I just don't like the look of it.
No, so. I can see that, and but like the shot that I'm thinking of when I say like the cinematography and this is amazing is there's this shot where she's being chased through the house, and the whole thing is done as a top-down shot. Yeah.
And they go upstairs without cutting.
They go upstairs, and
without cutting.
It's all one long take. You can tell that this house was built for the movie, because you can tell that they had to take out the roof, out the top, and actually film her going.
That shot was really, really impressive. As I watched that, I was like,
yeah.
Oh, that just totally cut. And I think the way they did it was with masking, clearly, because the way they masked it going from bottom stairs to upstairs, that's the only way that's possible in one shot.
Which, God bless the editor.
No
God
kidding,
bless the editor, because masking
flawless.
is a pain in the ass.
It is flawless, too.
Yes.
Like, the way they did it, it's flawless, and it works so well. And I totally agree. The cinematography in this movie is stellar, despite some of the issues that I had. You got to be careful especially in horror. You got to be careful moving the camera. And there's a couple shots where they use a really wide lens and they get like 4 or 5 people in one shot and they're like panning with a gimbal around everybody and it looks really cool, but then they do it again and it's like there's just a few things here and there that I didn't care too much about, but for the most part the cinematography is phenomenal. The color grading in some scenes is a little too blue, if you ask me, but other than that, it looks gorgeous. Like the whole movie is beautiful.
We're still getting a lot of that orange teal.
Yeah, the orange and teal look is heavy in this movie for real. For
sure.
But other than that, as far as the story goes, I'm like I said earlier, I'm torn on this movie because it's like on one hand, it is clearly an homage to everything that I enjoy in horror. On the other hand...
Which is why I thought you were going to like it.
Well, and in theory, this is like right up my alley, but as I was watching it, I found myself kind of bored with it.
Really?
Yeah. And part of that, I think, is... I mean, you know me, man. I'm not a huge fan of newer horror, first of all. I don't like the sheen perfectness that newer horror has, and it's because cinematography and stuff has become such an important piece in modern horror, and everybody kind of does the same thing. I think that might be part of it, because like the film language in this movie is great, but it's also really generic. Like I said, it felt like a very early to mid 2000s movie for me.
Okay, so moving on to like a different aspect of the movie, what did you think of the concept of the creature?
The concept's cool. I had figured out 45 minutes in what this movie was about.
Did you? Okay,
I did.
See, I did not, and maybe that's just me not paying as much attention as you, but I had a feel that there's a certain point in this movie where you go, and are we doing spoilers in this, by the way?
Let's go ahead and,
okay.
Spoiler alert right now.
Yeah, spoiler alert right now. So, at a certain point, I knew she's the creature. It took me... Maybe I should be more embarrassed of how long it took me, but I'm not. But it did take me a while to figure out really what the creature was and what aspect of her the creature was, if that makes any sense.
Right.
But and when I found out, like at a certain point you go, okay, this is what's going on. Like she is the creature, but she's not the creature at the same time.
They basically tell you at one point when she's running backwards through that hallway and her sister, I think it's her sister that like looks down the hallway and she's like running away kind of backwards. That was the moment where I was like, well, okay, they're just going to tell us what this is like forever before this even starts. Right. So it's like,
right.
I think my thing is with the name of this movie, the beginning line of "It's time to cut the cancer out," and the way the character kind of moves before they really let you in on what it is, I think it was just a little too obvious for me.
That's fair. I feel like I'm trying to do more and more movies, like not do more movies, but I'm trying to watch movies and keep myself conscious in the moment that's happening, because I feel like if you watch enough movies I feel like if you watch enough movies, you start to try to like anticipate what's going on in movies, and I'm really, really trying to just get lost in what's going on at the time.
That's fair.
Which I think is how these kinds of movies are supposed to be watched. Not that, you know,
yeah.
I mean, it's inherent that you're going to go, okay, this is what's going on and is what's going on, because this is the kind of movie where you do spend a good amount of time trying to figure out what the hell is just going on in this movie.
But I think that's why I don't know who this is aimed at, because
Right.
I mean, they're aiming it at horror people, but they try to keep this secret through like more than an hour through this movie of what's actually happening. But if you watch a lot of horror, I feel like it's really obvious. And
Yeah.
this movie is full of tropes. And
Oh,
like
yeah.
the first 35 minutes of this movie, I had like 8 tropes that I had noticed already that I was just kind of like, I don't know if this is. I just don't know. I just don't
No, that's
know.
fair.
And again, the same thing I had with Psycho Gorman. It's a little too aimed at me, but at the same
Yeah.
time, this is not aimed at me at all. Like this is kind of like this is for the
Fair
more
enough.
casual watcher, I guess is the best way to put it.
Right.
And I should also point out, I'm not a huge fan of The Conjuring, Saw, almost all the other movies that James Wan has
then
done.
I think we're just done here. Then.
So I think that's part of it. Like The Conjuring's cool, and the vibe is really cool. The way it's shot is really well done. The era that it's set in is really cool. None of that exists here, and
No, it's not like the movies and that might be part of the problem is it's so vastly different from what he's done.
right.
That I think if you go into this, like I didn't even know it was a James Wan movie going into it. It was just one of those things Brittany had been wanting to watch for like a good like week or two.
Yeah.
And then we finally got around to watching it. And even when I saw James Wan's name come up, I was like, oh shit, this is a James Wan movie. And again, I really do like the Annabelle and Conjuring movies, but it's because like ghost stories are my favorite horror. I like all sorts of different horror, but supernatural horror is like my favorite horror.
Right.
And The Conjuring, Annabelle, they're possession movies, and I love that type of stuff. But if you go into this going, oh, it's a James Wan movie, I think you're gonna be disappointed if you're not into anything, or if you're not into this type of movie.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, part of the problem. Possession is my least favorite genre of horror. Like, just in general, other than a handful of like absolute classics,
Because it's overdone.
that's part of it. But it's just never really like, I like slashers. You can see behind me. I like slashers. Like slashers are my genre of horror that I'm like really into, and
Right.
so. The possession and ghost thing has never really done much for me. So that's
fair.
definitely part of why I didn't care for this movie that much. I should be clear. I didn't hate it. I definitely
Right.
did not hate this movie. I just kind of felt like this was sort of mediocre. It's shot really well. The acting is... There are some points where I was like really taken out by some of the acting, but in general, it's pretty good.
Well, see, and I think the acting it was done that way on purpose. I think that was more of a director's choice
right.
than an actor's
But
choice.
see, that's the problem though, is I felt like he was trying to ride this line of goofy, but not all the way. And I
almost
think
like it's too self-aware.
Not that it's too self-aware. Like he didn't have the guts to fully go like he didn't have Army of Darkness in him, but he wanted to make an Army of Darkness type thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like,
yeah, absolutely.
Like the reason I think Army of Darkness works is because they fully lean into this is wacky and goofy, but also gory and sort of horror adjacent. And I feel like this movie would have done a little bit better had it leaned a little bit more into the self-awareness. Because I think my issue with it is it tries to take itself seriously while also being goofy. And I don't like trying to have your cake and eat it too. Like, that's the thing that I didn't like about it, is that there are points, like you said earlier, it's time to cut out the cancer, and the sweeping dolly shot in, and like the big heroic shot of her, like right before the credits roll, and all that
when
stuff.
dude's arm gets broken and he pulls it out and like stares at it, like
right,
and screams at his arm.
There's totally those moments that are totally great, but on the flip side of it, it also tries to take itself a little too seriously, and I feel like this movie may have benefited a little bit by setting it in the 80s. and also giving it some noise and giving it some grain and coloring it just a little bit differently and a little more faded.
Unpolishing it.
Yes. That's the biggest issue I have with it, man, is that it's too polished and too modern. The cinematography is great. And look, I'll say it this way. Seder is a great example of how you do modern horror in a cinematic, amazing way. From my point of view, at least. And this felt a little bit too polished and a little bit too high budget. I don't know what the budget actually was, to be fair, but like it just didn't work on that level for me.
I would imagine, with it being a James Wan movie, that it was probably a pretty decent budget.
Yeah, probably.
The dude, I mean,
the idea is great too. If you walked into some executive like, "This is my idea," like, I would hand him money for that for sure, based on his past movies and that idea for sure. I would hand him a bunch of money.
I'm currently pulling up Wikipedia because it'll tell us the budget. The budget was oh man. Okay, so the budget for this movie was $40 million. It did $29.9 million in the box office.
And this came out this year, right?
Yeah.
So that might be part of it. People are
September
still not
10th.
Okay, so people are still not. I didn't realize it was that new. People are still not super comfortable going to the theater, and when you dump it on something like HBO Max,
which a lot of people don't have.
Yeah, but I also don't know the people that do have it. How do you make your money back on that? I don't know how any of that works.
Well, the way you make your money back on it is you charge people in addition to your subscription fee. Like,
but you didn't
Disney
have to do
Plus.
that, right? Like,
no, they didn't do that.
But that's what I'm saying. Like, you didn't even make half your money back. Is that what you said?
Almost half.
Almost
it's like
half.
Okay, so it was a $40 million budget, and we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and round it up to $30 million.
I think the biggest issue with that is, had you put this out in October, it may have done a little bit better. And B, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. Who is this aimed at? This is a little bit too hardcore for casuals. It's not hardcore enough for hardcore horror fans.
Yeah.
I don't know who this is for. Like, I really don't. I'm not saying that to be a jerk. I genuinely don't know who this is for. It's fun and it's campy, but without the references of 80s horror, is it like, what is it? You know what I mean?
I think that's a fair assessment too, because like I said, if you look at the trailers, it does seem like they didn't know who to market it at.
I should have watched the trailers, yeah.
Because it is lumping in so many different genres into one. I think the people that this is aimed at, I think this is aimed at James Wan fans. That's who I think this movie is for.
So you mean it's like James Wan's version of Drag Me to Hell?
Yes. Yeah, yes. I think that's a very good way of putting it. It's
okay.
James Wan's version of Drag Me to Hell.
Right.
It's aimed at people that are fans of his work, because if you look at his work, it's not all the same stuff. I mean, The Conjuring and Insidious, they're both supernatural horror, but they're vastly different.
Yeah.
Saw is different from those. This is different from all of those. But I think that's what I like about James Wan is I think this really, really shows that he's not afraid to take risks with movies. Whether or not it pays off is completely irrelevant to this statement. But I think it shows that he's not afraid to branch out of what he's known for, and he's not afraid to branch out and try something new and try something different. So even if you don't like the movie, you have to at least give it to him for going out on a branch that he hasn't gone out on before.
I mean, it's definitely different. I don't know if it's different enough from the other stuff he specifically has done. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely different, and it's a cool idea. I like the idea. I got to tell you, man, an hour 50 is way too long, and by an hour 30, I was over it. I was just
I'll give
over
that to you.
So the beginning.
And that's the thing. That's the thing, though. Like 2 hours seems to be becoming the normal runtime for movies in general lately. Yeah. I blame every Marvel movie for that, because there's so many of them coming out on just a regular basis, and they're all 2 hours or longer, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Like they're all around that 2 hour runtime. And I'm noticing that becoming more and more normal, regardless of the movie you're watching. 2 hours roundabout seems to be the normal runtime, and 2 hours in my opinion, 2 hours for most movies is too long.
Oh, for sure.
I mean,
Sure.
if
An hour and a
I
half is the sweet spot for me.
right.
I've said that for years.
And it's I think a lot of that is because like if you go to see a play at a theater, most of the time you're gonna get a 2 to 3 hour runtime on like an actual theatrical play, but that's because there's an intermission involved, and you can see that in like if you look at older movies had the same thing where like you've got a 2 hour long or longer runtime. Gone with the Wind, Ben-Hur, Planet of the Apes, like these older movies that were still basing themselves on the theatrical kind of time frame were longer movies, and then we got into the more like hour and a half to hour or 100-minute runtime. That was a norm for a long time, and I feel like we're getting back into this 2 hour runtime being the norm, and it's just too long for most movies, I think.
Especially for horror movies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Horror movies should not be this long. There are things like The Witch that the pacing works really well. And then there are things like Seder that are an hour and what was that, like 15 or 20, an hour and 15 or an hour 20. And it still feels too long. So like pacing is a hard thing to nail. And especially in a movie like this, I really feel like the first 35 minutes, by 35 minutes, I looked at the runtime and I was like, not a whole lot has happened. Like if we could really cut some of the fat off this first 35 minutes, and it would help the pacing a little bit more because it takes forever to get to a point of figuring out what is going on.
Right. Well, I feel like you could have cut out, honestly, you could have cut out one of the death scenes in this movie, and with how much is involved in the death scene, with the setup for the death scene, her realizing she's in it, and then the reaction and her waking up, you take out those are the three elements of each death scene. Is her in a dream, seeing the murder, and then realizing she's in a dream, waking up, and then processing everything. You take out one of those and you're cutting off 20 minutes off of this runtime, and you're bringing yourself down to an hour and a half right there.
I mean, I feel like the male nurse, probably didn't need to be in there. I felt like the only reason he was in there was because he was there when all this was happening. And so he got killed. The murder in that part is crazy. And it's, I should also mention the actual effects that they use that are not CGI are amazing. The practical effects in this movie that are there, especially when they pan around the backside of her and go to Gabriel for the first time, and he's there with his little claws, and you can see his like rib cage and his little face,
his
and
no
everything.
hands.
It's crazy, and it's so cool.
I will say this is definitely his most CGI heavy movie, though.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. There's so little of that in here that the rest of it is so green screened and so just fake feeling that like every time she gets paralyzed and like is witnessing these murders, the room starts to do this weird melting effect and everything. It's cool the first time. The following 5 times it happens, I'm like, okay, it's happening again. Same exact effect. Like, it's just stuff like that with the pacing that didn't really work for me. But the practical effects that are in here are rad. They are so cool. And it further reinforces why I'm torn about this movie, because it's like they tried that. I could tell he really tried to make this appeal to horror fans that are self-aware or that are aware enough of 80s and 90s and even 2000s horror. But it's just not enough, and it feels a little too casual, and that's how I feel about it. So you said you liked it. What would you rate this? Because I want to hear what you have to say first. What are your final thoughts and ratings on this movie?
I thought it was a very, very fun ride. I think if you're listening to this podcast, you've either watched it or you no longer get to go into this movie blind like you and I did.
Yeah.
I would give it, and I think that's a big part of it is going into it kind of blind, because you're able to kind of enjoy the ride as it's happening.
Yeah.
And I would personally give this a 7 out of 10, but it's because I think I'm a little biased because I do like, I've never seen a James Wan movie I didn't like. We'll put it that way. I'm a big fan of his work. I'm a big fan of the movies that he makes. Every movie he's made, I've enjoyed to an extent, some more than others. But yeah, I would give this a 7 out of 10 for sure.
Okay. Okay, my thoughts are you need to step in one direction or the other. You're riding the line of goofy and serious too much, and it doesn't work for me because of it.
Right.
The fact that I can't pin down who this is for is a problem. It's as a hardcore horror fan, I didn't walk away feeling like this was made for me. As
Fair
somebody
enough.
who's more casual, I may have been totally fine with it and didn't think about all of the weird little tropes and everything else. That may be who this is targeted for, is the more casual horror fan that just sort of likes to watch scary movies every now and then. And that's totally fine. But I went into it because of who made this. James Wan has done a lot of horror movies and a lot of stuff that appeals to hardcore horror fans. I went into it expecting that. Now, I didn't watch trailers. I didn't read a synopsis. I didn't do any homework on this before I sat down to watch it, other than you said, you'll probably like this. Let's do this for the podcast. And so I went into it with, that was the only thing I went into it with. And so I just feel like it's a little too wacky. It's a little too serious, not enough in either direction. And because of it, it really suffers for me. It also drags a lot. But on the flip side of that, the practical effects are awesome. The idea is phenomenal. The monster is scary, especially in the first half of this, before you figure out it's her. And when it's just this shadowy, dark figure before they give her the trench coat and the crow-like look that she has to her.
It did have a bit of a Brandon Lee kind of thing going on.
And I was like, I got really excited for the first little bit because I was like, oh, this is going to be this weird, like, creature that is broken in and haunting them and all that. And then it turns out that it's her, and it's kind of like,
but it's not her.
For me.
It's her.
I get it. It's Gabriel. It's her twin who lives in the back of her skull. I get it. Also, the setup from when she was a kid, all the creepy conversations, more of that for the setup of this movie. You don't get that stuff until we know what Gabriel is, until we're well aware of what's happening. You put that maybe in the credits, maybe any of that stuff in the beginning so that we get more of a setup other than abused housewife. I think that would have worked a little bit more for me. Also, the setup of how Gabriel comes into existence, of the husband like slamming her into, I thought that was a little goofy, but I loved out of that what came from her head is constantly bleeding and she can't figure out why. That is such a cool idea. And then later he breaks out of her, and that's where you kind of lose me. So I feel like, despite the pacing issues in the first half is such a cool idea for a horror movie, and then you kind of turn, like I said earlier, I kind of felt like they didn't know where to go with it. So they took this weird left turn that was, okay, well, I don't know what to do with this, so let's just go goofy and make him run around like this the whole time, and then, pop the arms out of socket or something, I guess, because, like, how our movements, like, it just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense.
Maybe she was double jointed.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. We'll never know because it's never brought up once.
Never know.
There is one part where he kind of like what feels like maybe pops him out of the socket or something.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what it is, but it's not clear enough, and it just doesn't make. It just didn't work for me as well as I thought it might.
That's fair.
So I would go ahead and rate this as a 6 out of 10. It's good, and it's definitely above average.
Right.
I was expecting more out of it based on who made this movie, and now that I know the freaking budget on this thing, come on, dude. That's kind of how I'm feeling about this. So,
no, that's fair. I think the points you're raising are valid. I think again, it's a matter of personal preference. And
yes.
I think because what I'm getting from what you're saying is that what it did pretty well. It didn't do it amazingly well, but the things it did do well, it did very well.
Yeah.
Like as far as like the elements of the movie that it did do well, it nailed them. I think if the pacing and the runtime was a little bit lower, I think that would have probably impacted your input a little bit more.
Well, the other part of it is the fact that 45 minutes in, I had already kind of guessed and figured out what everything was going on. There's some stuff in there that you could cut that would not have allowed me to figure that out. And
right.
And that I think is the other big issue I had with this. 45 minutes in, I figured that out. I still had over an hour to go once I figured out what was going on in this movie, just based on the small story elements that I had seen already, the name of the movie, and the beginning of "It's time to cut the cancer out." All of that stuff lent itself to figuring out what this movie was well before they wanted me to. And so I've got an hour 15 still by the time I figured that out. And it just dragged for me.
Right.
So, but it's good. It's well directed. It's really well shot. The color grading is great.
Would you say it's worth
watching? The lighting is really good. It's definitely worth watching. I will probably not watch this again. And I don't know. It's just this weird generic of cool, or weird mix of generic and cool that just, it works, but it also doesn't. So
right.
It's almost right in the middle for me. It's just a little bit better than meh. So
well, that's fair.
Yeah. So okay. So I think that went well. I think this format works. I think this format works really well. As far as people listening to this on podcast catchers, I guess, is that what they're called still? On podcast apps. I think this is the new format. So we're still going to continue to put stuff up on the RSS feed for audio only, but we have moved the YouTube channel. So these are no longer going up on Mike the Finder YouTube page. So this is its own thing now. We're going to try to be growing this as its own thing. I'm probably going to do some solo movie reviews on here. You may do that in the future as well.
It's quite possible.
This page has become more about, I think, growing From the Deep as a brand and as a horror movie thing. Or maybe not even a horror movie, just movie thing in general. So if you see all of our new assets here around us, the graveyard and all of this stuff, I'm going to link the graphic designer who did that down below in the description because she killed it.
Thank you to her, by the way.
Yeah, I think she killed it. At Stranger Creations on Instagram, she absolutely killed it. They look great, and I think this new branding and this new page and everything, this is going to be better for everyone involved. And I think it just separates my stuff from the deep stuff a little bit better, and it just works better. So
yeah, for sure.
Okay, so thank you guys for watching this. If you got all the way to the end of it, because that was a long review here. Make sure you hit subscribe on this channel because we are trying to grow this from scratch. So if you want us to do more of this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It's really going to help fuel us to do more stuff because we're starting from scratch here. And if you like what we're doing, make sure you let us know in one way or another because these are really fun to do, but it's very difficult to get the two of us together in a room long enough to do it. And so we need the fuel of knowing people are liking what we're doing to make sure that we can get more of these done. So thank you guys so much for watching. You got any more final thoughts here before we log out?
No, I would encourage people to, again, like you said, like the channel, leave comments, leave some viewer suggestions. We'd love to do. Yeah. I say this on my channel all the time. I'm going to say it on this one too. I'd love to see comments down below for movies that people want us to review. I'd love for it to be more of a community thing.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you guys for watching, and we will see you guys next time on From the Deep. See ya.
Bye-bye.